Okay, welcome to another Orbiter 2010 video, and this video is actually going to be a little different from my usual videos in that I'm not actually going to be completing a mission. All I wanted to explain in this video was a little bit about the eject orientation, and I wanted to show something that we can do to improve our relative inclination as we're climbing up through the atmosphere. And the reason I'm making this video is because I want it to sort of be a complement video for the Earth to Mars series that I did, and it also will really go along with any video that I do for going to any body or any planet for that matter. And basically when we're on the ground and we're getting everything set up, which I've already done here, by the way. I'm not going to take the time to go through and set up TransX. This is already set up to go to Mars. As one of the final things that we do when setting up these TransX plans is we configure this eject orientation. And the way we adjust that, if you go back and watch part 1 and part 2 of the Earth to Mars video, you'll see how we come up with this adjustment. And it says here that my heading is going to be 121.6 degrees, or about 120 degrees, and that's roughly in line with the runway here at Wide Awake International. So fortunately for me in this particular case, I can basically go straight forward and fly out. It's actually preferable to have a heading that's closer to 90 degrees. That way you have the maximum benefit of the rotation of the planet. So this is actually less than ideal, even though it lines up well with the runway. But what I wanted to really get into here is this eject orientation. Normally when I'm at this point, and when I say normally, I'm just referring to what I did in the Earth to Mars video, is I'll bring up a line plane. You'll see me do this, you've seen me do this in a lot of my other videos. And I'll press ELS, and I'll put in the inclination, which is 29.02, then space, and then the longitude of the ascending node, which in this case is 102. And what that does is it gives me a line plane so that as I'm flying up through the atmosphere, I can see my rate, if it's going negative or positive. And if it, you always want it to be negative, which means your relative inclination is coming down. Excuse me. But what you can do that's actually better than this is you can make an adjustment to your eject orientation as you're going up through the atmosphere and going, eventually getting into orbit. And I'm going to try to explain why it's better to do it that way. So let me start just by getting rid of the line plane, because we're not going to use it. I've put together a few little slides, I guess you could call them, and hopefully this will help explain this, and hopefully these are done well enough that it will make sense and not just lead to further confusion. So here we are on the runway at Wide Awake International, and this dash green line, in this case, I intend it to indicate the direction of flight that we want in order to be in plane with the eject orientation, or I should say in order to be in line with the eject orientation. As I said previously, in this case that we're at Wide Awake International on this particular day for this particular launch, it works out that we are actually, our eject orientation is really close to our flight path, so we can actually follow basically the runway heading and have our eject orientation. But what usually happens, what can happen, what almost always happens, is this is the path that you want, the green line. This represents, your intended flight path. This is where you want to be going in order to cross over the node so that you can have the proper eject point out to Mars. But what usually happens is you end up not following this path exactly. For whatever reason, you take off and you are a little bit off of this path. And if orbiter simulated wind, then wind could be one factor. It would push you off path a little bit. So what happens when you get off path? Well, usually, or at least if you're doing the aligned plane MFD method, what you have to do, if you get off path like here, you have to basically turn sharply to fly back to this green line, so that if you get the further you get off, the more bank that you have to put in to get back in line with this original green line. But what is better would be this type of scenario, where this is the line that you want to follow, but you end up following this line by mistake, or winds are pushing you off, or you just couldn't get the runway heading that you needed to get. Whatever the case, you end up following this path. What this represents here is a point in our flight where we're making a change to our eject orientation on the fly. So instead of having to turn sharply to fly right back over here and then follow this green line, what we're doing here is we're saying, let's make a quick adjustment to our eject orientation from our current position, which is right here, and let's have that eject orientation give us a new flight path based on where we're at right now. And where we're at right now is right at this spot. And we're now going to follow this flight path so that we will eventually be back in line with this green line. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. This comes into play especially when you have an eject orientation that's not close to your runway heading. Remember, I said 90 degrees is the best eject orientation. So at wide awake, let's say we get that. Let's say we get an eject orientation of 90 degrees. Well, since the runway heading is about 120 degrees, then 90 degrees would be like something like this. I don't know if my angles are exactly right, but it would be, something like that. So immediately, as soon as we take off and start heading down the runway, we're already off from this green path. So that means as soon as we take off and get in the air, we have to turn really hard to get back in line with this green line. But what we can do instead, again, instead of trying to just bank super hard aggressively to get over here, we can readjust our eject orientation, as after we get up to say 1,000 meters a second, something like that, and we can get a new flight path, a new path to follow to get back eventually into line with this green line. You notice these lines don't intersect right here because that would be a really aggressive turn, but imagine that these lines keep going out. Eventually this will intersect again with that green line and we'll be back on our flight path. So that's what I wanted to talk about a little bit in this video, and I know it can be a little confusing, but I think if you understand this point, it will be easier to get a better relative inclination as you're flying up through the atmosphere. And to help illustrate this point, I'm actually wanting to do a flight, just the atmospheric part. So let me make a quick adjustment do the eject orientation to get it correct to the runway right now. And there is another element to this eject orientation that I want to mention that I almost forgot about. And that is, with each passing minute, each passing moment, each passing second, the Earth is rotating. So you'll notice just now I did a slight adjustment to the eject orientation to get it back in line with where we're at right now. And the reason I did that is because I've been sitting here explaining things, showing you those slides for the last couple of minutes. And during that time that I've been explaining that, the Earth is rotated a little bit, and what that causes, what ends up happening is that your white line ends up looking like this with each passing minute. You know, maybe 10 minutes from now, it might look something like that. The point is, it's getting farther off from our current location, so we have to constantly adjust this white line to bring it back to our present position. This is where we are right now. And that where we are right now, in terms of space, is technically changing by the second because the Earth is rotating. But once you're dialed in and you're ready to go, you know, this is valid for now, and it will be valid for maybe, 60 seconds or 120 seconds, and then we would have to make another adjustment. But once you're dialed in and you're ready to go, then I'll show how you can make adjustments to this while in flight so that it will improve your overall relative inclination by the time you get up to orbit. So let's turn the APU on. Let's turn surface controls on. And let me go ahead and grab the joystick because I feel like I do better when I have it. And you'll just have to bear with me for a few minutes while I fly up through the atmosphere. This part does take 10 or 12 minutes, something like that. Just make sure I have everything ready. Turn off external cooling. And we're ready to go. I'm going to bring this up in a larger MFD just so it's easier to see while we're going. And that should be fine. And I can actually see here already it's not perfect anymore. It's a little bit off, so I'm going to do one small bump. And there it is, it's more accurate now. Okay, so we're going to head out.
knots. V1.
Get our rotate call out in a second. I didn't hear it, so I'm going to throttle back and pitch up. And the reason I throttle back is
Wheels up.
so I don't overstress the gear.
Gear up. Gear up and locked.
As soon as the gear's up and locked, back to full main. Then I like to pitch up fairly aggressively to get up out of the thick part of the atmosphere, but this part of the flight isn't really relevant to this eject orientation discussion. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to bank here a little bit until I find the point where the eject orientation is, or excuse me, the relative inclination is starting to count backwards, and it's about right there. So I'm going to bank a little bit more left. Now it's actually starting to go up. So I'm just going to find the point where it's going down, and then I'm just going to try to hold that position. And again, bear with me for a moment while we get through this normal part of the flight, and then I'll show you more about this idea of improving the eject orientation. Okay, here at about 15 kilometers, I like to pitch down, get level with the horizon, get ready for the scram ascent. Just keeping an eye on the relative inclination. Oops, I didn't mean to dip below the horizon.
Mach 2.
Now you can see our white line is actually, if you compare it to this green ellipse,
Mach
this
3.
one moment, there's Mach 3. So we need to open the scram doors. Go full main on the scram. Kill the main engines and begin pitching up. But we're getting now to the point where I can start showing how to make an adjustment to the eject orientation on the fly as to improve your overall relative inclination. You notice here how this green line is off from this white line. This white line is behind, and it's behind for two reasons. Number one is the rotation of the Earth, and number two is just the fact that we're not flying an absolutely perfect line from that spot on the runway. That perfect line would be maybe like that, and we're maybe off just a little bit. So because I'm off, I'm going to make an adjustment here just by going like that, and I'm bringing that white line around till it's perfectly lined up again with this position. This number is now more accurate than it was a moment ago. And if I continue doing that all the way up through the atmosphere, then I'll have a more accurate relative inclination and a lower relative inclination than I would if I just followed the aligned plane MFD. So I'm going to pitch down here. I'm climbing a little too fast, but it's a little hard to get this ascent profile perfectly correct because I'm trying to explain so much while doing this flight.
Mach 7.
But you can see just, watching that white line, watching our relative inclination, as with each passing minute, that white line falls a little bit farther behind our current location, which means that relative inclination number is a little bit inaccurate. And it falls behind for those two reasons: the rotation of the planet and the fact that we're not able to hold an exact perfect flight line. We just, human error, or, orbiter doesn't simulate winds, but if there were winds involved, then that would be another factor. So here again, I'm just going to make an adjustment like that. It's really close to our current location, and this number is now more accurate than it was a second ago. Now, the reason I didn't explain all this in my Earth to Mars video is because I feel this concept is a little bit too advanced for, general learning. I think that this is something that's best left for after the fact, after you've already figured out how to get to Mars. Then you can come back and learn these types of additional things. Now, something else I need to mention: as that relative inclination gets lower and lower, the sensitivity of that white line becomes ever more sensitive. So that adjustment here, where currently it's on fine, eventually I'll need to make that super, and then ultra, and eventually hyper. But this number, as it gets closer to 1, it gets more sensitive. So let me bump this forward a little bit. And it's already so sensitive that just a couple of
Mach
adjustments
13.
moved it significantly, so I want to have it now down to a super setting. You can see how well lined up that is. Relative inclination coming down. Also, as the relative inclination gets roughly around 1,
Mach 14.
you really want to watch your bank and make sure that your relative inclination isn't counting down super fast. Because what will happen is once it reaches, a 0.1 something, then it starts counting down so
Warning.
fast that
Scram 15.
you'll overshoot and go in the other direction. So to prevent that from happening, once it gets down, to 1.0 and lower,
Warning. Scram fuel depleted.
close the scram doors, go back to full main. Once it gets down to 1.0 and lower, you want to watch your bank
16.
so that that number isn't counting down so aggressively. And here again we're off, so I'm going to bump it forward like that, and now we're more accurate. I need to pitch up here. I'm actually below the horizon. And if you do this
17.
with a little bit of practice and without the distractions of making a video and trying to talk at the same time, you can actually end up in orbit with a relative inclination of 0.00. I've done it, it's not that difficult. I'm actually gonna have to switch over now to
Rotation.
rotation. Do a bit of an adjustment. But the key here is just to make sure
Mach
that the
19.
relative inclination is always counting down and not going up, and that you are adjusting the white line to your current location, continuously, and making the necessary adjustments to the sensitivity so that you're not getting real aggressive. Here it needs to come down again.
Mach 20.
So now we're at the alter setting. And the closer we get to 0, the slower we want that number to count down,
APU
because you'll
90%.
overshoot quickly.
Mach 21.
Making another adjustment. See how low that's getting? Now I really want to have that, I really want my vessel to be
Mach 22.
without much bank in it now, because we're getting so low that we're going to end up overshooting and going the other direction. So now I'm banking the other way. Make a bit of an adjustment. See, I'm slowing it down
23.
by banking more to the left. Now I need to watch my apoapsis over here. .0. Now we're overshooting.
Mach 24.
Let me see what my, there we go.
Mach 25.
Okay, so we reached our target apoapsis of about 200 kilometers. And notice the relative inclination will continue to count down while you're still in, this part of the atmosphere when you're below about 90 kilometers. Unfortunately, I didn't bank quickly enough, so I overshot the other direction and it started counting up. So now I'm just going to try to bank this way until I'm up to about 90 kilometers or so. But you can see that I'll have a near perfect relative inclination when all is said and done.
Mach 26.
Got that white line right on the current location, and we're all the way down to the alter setting. And as I get farther up in the atmosphere, This is just going to continue to slow down. Go ahead and turn the APU off. This will continue to slow down because I'm getting, less and less effect from the atmosphere. Go ahead and set the joystick aside. We don't need it anymore. Just keeping an eye on that, watching it
Mach 27 plus.
continue to count down as we continue to climb up through the atmosphere. And we can go ahead and do another adjustment to check the accuracy. But that's a very accurate relative inclination to have, just through the initial ride to orbit. And this was going to be much closer than if we just used the align plane MFD method. And if I have any concerns here with it counting the other direction, I can of course, do some rotations, but right now it's still going in the direction that I want it to go in. Okay, so that is basically the idea, and that's all I wanted to explain in this video. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. The only thing I will say beyond this point is this concept applies whether you're taking off from a body like the Earth or the Moon or anywhere. It also applies if you're already in orbit. So suppose that we were already in orbit and then we set up our plan for going to the Moon, or actually the Moon might be a bad example, but set up our plan for going to Mars after we were already in orbit. We can still do this adjustment through, on the fly to our eject orientation as we're, already in orbit. It doesn't have to be just when you're taking off from the ground. It just usually works out that when you're taking off from the ground and getting up into orbit, that's usually when you have most concern for getting a low relative inclination. So in that case, you definitely want to do this method if you're comfortable with it. If you can, fit it into your launch, then do it. And again, it's an extra step. It does complicate the flight a bit. So if it's not something that you feel you can handle, then just ignore it until you've already got, a dozen or a couple dozen of flights to Mars under your belt. And then when you're completely comfortable with that process, come back, watch the video again, and then see if you can fit this into your launch profile at that time. I think that's everything that I wanted to cover. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up, and I'll see you in the next video. If you have any questions about this, any comments, anything like that, go ahead and leave a comment down below, and I'll be sure to address your questions. For this eject orientation, and the way we adjust that, if you go back and watch part 1 and part 2 of the Earth to Mars video, you'll see how we come up with this adjustment. And it says here that my heading is going to be 121.6 degrees, or about 120 degrees, and that's roughly in line with the runway here at Wide Awake International. So fortunately for me in this particular case, I can basically go straight forward and fly out. Me do this in a lot of my other videos. And I'll press ELS and I'll put in the inclination, which is 29.02, then space, and then the longitude of the ascending node, which in this case is 102. And what that does is it gives me a line plane so that as I'm flying up through the atmosphere, I can see my rate, if it's going negative or positive. And if it, you always want it to be negative, which means your relative inclination is coming down. Excuse me. a complement video for the Earth to Mars series that I did, and it also will really go along with any video that I do for going to any, body or any planet for that matter. And basically, when we're on the ground and we're getting everything set up, which I've already done here, by the way, I'm not going to take the time to go through and set up TransX. This is already set up to go to Mars. As one of the final things that we do when setting up these TransX plans is we configure. It's actually preferable to have a heading that's closer to 90 degrees. That way you have the maximum benefit of the rotation of the planet. So this is actually less than ideal, even though it lines up well with the runway. But what I wanted to really get into here is this eject orientation. Normally, when I'm at this point, and when I say normally, I'm just referring to what I did in the Earth to Mars video, is I'll bring up a line plane. You'll see me do this, and you've seen. Okay, welcome to another Orbiter 2010 video. And this video is actually going to be a little different from my usual videos in that I'm not actually going to be completing a mission. All I wanted to explain in this video was a little bit about the eject orientation, and I wanted to show something that we can do to improve our relative inclination as we're climbing up through the atmosphere. And the reason I'm making this video is because I want it to sort of be a